I never believed a person could break quietly, like a branch that bends under weight, but doesn't snap loudly enough for the world to notice. Pain, I learned, doesn't always come in screams. Sometimes it comes in silence, in the moment someone you raised with love looks past you as if you are a burden he never asked for. My name is Grace, and this is the story of the day I realized my place in my own family was not what I thought it was. I spent most of my life believing love was unshakable, that a mother and her child were bound forever. I cooked, I worked, I sacrificed, and I prayed over my son every night when he was small. And then one afternoon, standing in my own living room, with my hands trembling at my sides, I heard words I never imagined would be spoken to me. You have to choose, your mother or me. My daughter-in-law said it with a straight face. No tears, no shame, as if she hadn't just shattered the world I spent years building. My son didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, the way you look at an old photograph you're not sure you want to keep anymore. And that silence is what broke me. I didn't scream, I didn't beg, I simply stood there, nodding slowly, feeling the weight of 45 years press into my chest. Because in that moment, I understood. He wasn't choosing me, not today, maybe not ever again. People think heartbreak comes like a storm. Loud, violent, sudden, but mine arrived like winter. Cold, creeping, and quiet, taking pieces of me a little at a time. This is not a story of anger. It is not a story of revenge. It is a story of love, disappointment, and the painful kind of forgiveness a mother learns only through loss. If you have ever given everything you had, and still felt like you were not enough. If you have ever loved someone who slowly drifted away. If you have ever stood in a home you built and felt like a stranger in it. Then sit with me, walk with me through this memory. Let me tell you how I got here, how I broke, and how, somehow, I learned to breathe again. Because there is a lesson at the end of this road. A gentle one, a quiet one I wish I had understood before the day my daughter-in-law drew a line and asked my son to stand on one side of it. And when he stepped away from me, I finally learned what it means to let go. I was never a woman who needed much from life. A warm cup of tea in the morning, sunlight in the hallway, and the sound of my son laughing, that was enough for me. My world was small, but it was peaceful. For many years, it was just me and him, side by side, growing through life together. I raised him alone after losing my husband early, and though life was never easy, I never complained. He was my reason to wake up each day, to keep going, to smile. His name is Arjun. Even now, when I say it, it rests softly on my tongue, like a prayer I have whispered for decades. He was my boy, curious, gentle, with a heart that cared too deeply for others. I remember his first day of school, how his tiny fingers wrapped around mine, afraid to let go. I promised him then that I would always be beside him. I suppose I believed he would always be beside me too. When he grew older, taller than me, broader in shoulder, I watched him become a man. A good man, responsible, kind, the kind every mother prays to raise. Our home, though small, was full of laughter then. He would sit with me in the evenings, telling me stories about his college, about new friends, new dreams. I would listen, smiling, even when I did not understand half the modern things he spoke of. His voice itself was comfort. People told me I should think about remarriage, that a woman should not live alone. But I never felt alone. Not truly. I had Arjun. My life revolved around him, his meals, his education, his future. When I stitched clothes for extra income, it was with pride that I saved every rupee for him. When he slept, I would quietly check whether he had enough blanket, enough warmth. A mother's habits never grow old. And then came the day he told me he had met someone. He was shy when he brought it up, like a boy again. We were sitting in the kitchen, the evening breeze slipping through the window, carrying the smell of rain. He cleared his throat twice before speaking. "Ma," he said, eyes lowered, "there is someone I care about." My heart did not ache then, it fluttered. I was happy. Truly. What mother does not want her child to find love? A new chapter, a new journey. I imagined myself welcoming another daughter into my life, teaching her recipes I learned from my own mother, sharing laughter as we arranged the kitchen, talking late into the night like old friends. I imagined growing old with not loneliness, but with family, noisy, warm, full. Her name was Ria. The first time I met her, she seemed polite enough. She smiled faintly, spoke softly. She came from a good family, educated, confident. I served her tea, and she said thank you with a voice that was sweet but distant. I tried to bridge the gap, asking about her work, her parents, her hobbies, but her answers were short, like someone speaking to a stranger in a waiting room. Still, I made no judgments. Relationships take time to bloom. And I wanted to love her, honestly, I did. Soon they were engaged. The house became busy again, relatives, calls, shopping lists, rituals. I was tired, but happy. When they finally married, I watched my son place Sindor in her hair with a trembling smile. He looked at her the way a man looks at the world he is ready to build, with hope, with love. It was beautiful. It was bittersweet, because for the first time, I felt the space beside me was no longer mine. When we came home after the wedding, I noticed small things. Rhea liked silence, not chatter. She kept distance, not closeness. She rearranged the kitchen, changed the curtains, replaced things I held onto for years. I tried to adjust. A new bride wants the house to feel like hers, I understood. I told myself to let go of old habits, old possessions, old comforts. But slowly, something shifted. The home that once echoed with my son's laughter began to echo with footsteps that were not mine. Decisions were made without asking me. Plans formed without including me. They ate dinner together in their room sometimes, leaving me alone at the table. At night, when I lay in bed, I told myself it was normal. Children grow. Wives come. Mothers eventually become background. That is the way life moves. But deep inside, a quiet fear began to grow, fear of being forgotten. There was still love, yes. My son would sit with me sometimes and ask about my day. He still smiled at me with that same gentle warmth. But there was something new in his eyes, a pull, a division. Like his heart was being asked to split into two worlds, and he did not know how to hold both. I tried my best to never burden him. I made space, stepped back, let them have their time. I reminded myself that love is not possession. A mother must let go when her son finds his own wings. Maybe I held too tightly once, maybe I still did. I do not know. All I knew was that I loved him enough to fold myself quietly into the corners of his life. But corners get cold, and over time, they become invisible. I did not realize then that this quiet distance was only the beginning. A slow unraveling, a gentle fading of presence. I thought things would get better. I thought she would warm up. I thought one day she would call me, Ma, with affection instead of obligation. But stories do not always unfold the way we pray they will. Sometimes love is not enough to hold a family together. Sometimes silence becomes the real enemy. And sometimes, the person you love most is the one who has to choose, and they choose someone else. Tension does not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes like a whisper under a closed door. The first real disagreement happened on a Sunday morning. Tension does not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes like a whisper under a closed door. The first real disagreement happened on a Sunday morning. I woke early, as always, and prepared breakfast, her favorite parathas, the ones she once complimented with a smile. When she came into the kitchen, she barely looked at the plate. "Oh, we were thinking of eating out today," she said, glancing at my son. He hesitated, just a second, and then nodded. I smiled, hiding the small ache in my chest. "Of course," I said, "go, enjoy yourselves." But that was the moment I noticed, I wasn't part of we anymore. They left together, laughing. I stayed back, quietly cleaning plates that no one ate from. Later that week, I heard them whispering in their room. Voices low, tense, hurried. I pretended not to hear, a habit mothers learn when their children grow. Sometimes I would walk into the living room, and they would fall silent suddenly, as though my presence pushed away their words. I told myself not to take it personally, but loneliness has a voice, and it was beginning to speak louder inside me. One evening, I was setting the dining table when I heard her say, "She's always here. I need space. We need our own life." My son's reply was softer, harder to hear, but I knew it was defense mixed with confusion. They didn't know I was standing in the hallway, tears gathering but not falling. I swallowed my sadness and continued laying the plates. Another day, she suggested hiring a maid to do the cooking and chores. She said it gently, but the meaning wasn't gentle. I had spent years caring for this home with my hands and heart. I didn't need praise, but erasing my role felt like erasing my place. Still, I smiled. If it makes you comfortable, we can try, I said. Inside, though, I began to shrink like fabric washed too many times. Then came the moment that changed everything, a small spark, but it lit a fire in silence. My son and I were sitting together one afternoon, drinking tea. He was telling me about work, like old times, his voice relaxed. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had gotten my boy back, just for a moment. Then she entered the room. She saw us laughing. Her expression tightened, not angry, but unsettled, as if something delicate was slipping from her hand. She placed her mug down harder than necessary. "I was waiting for you," she said to my son. He looked confused. "For what?" "You said we'd go shopping," she replied, eyes flicking toward me for 1 second, quick, sharp, meaningful. I lowered my gaze, pretending not to notice. He stood up slowly, torn between two worlds, the world that raised him and the world he lived in now. "I'll go change," he said quietly. They left together, but he glanced back at me once, a small look, full of apology but no words. I smiled to reassure him. Because mothers always smile, even when their hearts tremble. But after that day, things grew heavier. She began deciding things without me, meals, furniture, routines. I was informed, not asked. My voice felt like a guest in my own house. And though my son tried, gently, lovingly, to keep balance, I could see the strain in his eyes. He was stretched between loyalty and marriage, two ropes pulling in opposite directions. Until one night, the night I will never forget. The night she told him to choose. I remember sitting alone that evening, long after they had gone to bed. The house felt different, not angry, not loud. Just painfully quiet. The kind of quiet that forces you to hear your thoughts, even the ones you'd rather ignore. My tea had gone cold between my hands, but I kept holding the cup, maybe because it was the only warm thing left in my life that night. For the first time in years, I let myself think about the idea of leaving. Not out of resentment, but out of love, the kind of love that doesn't cling when it is no longer wanted. I whispered to myself, maybe stepping away is the only way he'll truly understand. And strangely, it didn't hurt the way I expected. It felt gentle, like releasing a bird you've held too tightly for too long. The next morning, I cooked breakfast quietly, chapatis puffing on the pan, tea boiling softly. The same routine, but my heart had shifted overnight. No bitterness, no pleading, just acceptance. My son came into the kitchen, expecting perhaps anger or disappointment. Instead, I greeted him with a soft smile, the kind a mother gives even when she's breaking. He looked surprised. "Mom, about yesterday," he began. I placed a chapati on his plate and spoke slowly, kindly. "You made your choice. Now let me make mine." He froze, not out of defiance, but confusion, maybe even fear. He had never seen me choose myself. When my daughter-in-law walked in, avoiding eye contact like a child caught doing something wrong, I simply handed her tea. Politeness is powerful, especially when it replaces pain. I packed with steady hands. No drama, no raised voices, just folded saris, carefully stacked, like memories I was tucking away. I touched the frames on the wall. My son as a child, smiling toothless. The three of us laughing on a picnic years ago. These were moments no argument could erase. Love existed, even if it wasn't visible now. When I zipped the final bag, I paused. This house had once felt like the center of my world. Now, it was only a building. My daughter-in-law stood in the doorway, arms crossed, but her eyes flickered with something unsure, guilt maybe, or fear of being judged later. I did not fight her. I did not accuse her. I just said softly, "Take care of him. He deserves happiness." Her expression cracked, if only for a second. She didn't respond, but she heard me. Sometimes silence is the only apology people know how to give. At the door, my son broke. Bag in hand, sandals on, I turned to leave, and that is when he finally spoke, voice trembling like a little boy. "Mom. You don't have to go." I smiled, a real one this time, not one forced between pain. Maybe not, but sometimes leaving isn't abandonment. Sometimes it's love in a different form. He wanted to hug me, I could see it in his eyes, but guilt kept him rooted. He wasn't ready to choose me, and I wasn't going to wait forever for him to try. So I stepped out, letting the morning air wrap gently around me, like freedom. For the first time in many years, I felt light. Not because I stopped loving them, but because I finally loved myself too. Healing didn't happen overnight. The first few days away were strange, like learning to breathe a different kind of air. I stayed with an old friend for a while. We laughed, cooked together, shared stories over tea. No tension, no whispers, no choosing sides, just peace. And slowly, without realizing, pieces of me I thought were lost began returning. My voice, my hobbies, my smile. One evening, as we sat watching the sun dip behind the trees, she said, "You look like yourself again." I hadn't noticed, but she was right. One day, he visited. My son arrived unexpectedly, holding an old photo, one of him sitting on my lap, chubby cheeks and bright eyes. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked, "Can I sit? Just for tea?" There was no resentment in me, only softness. We talked, not as mother and child demanding love, but as two humans trying to understand each other. He apologized without words, I forgave without conditions. Some relationships aren't meant to be chosen. They simply exist, even through distance, even through hurt. I realized then, I was not broken, just bent for too long. And now I was standing again. When the door closed that night, the house suddenly felt too large for one heart. I walked through each room slowly, touching chairs, curtains, family frames, almost like I was saying goodbye without knowing why. There was no anger inside me, only a quiet emptiness that sat like air after rain, still. I smiled, a real one this time, not one forced between pain. Maybe not, but sometimes leaving isn't abandonment. Sometimes it's love in a different form. He wanted to hug me, I could see it in his eyes, but guilt kept him rooted. He wasn't ready to choose me, and I wasn't going to wait forever for him to try. So I stepped out, letting the morning air wrap gently around me, like freedom. For the first time in many years, I felt light. Not because I stopped loving them, but because I finally loved myself too. Healing didn't happen overnight. The first few days away were strange, like learning to breathe a different kind of air. I stayed with an old friend for a while. We laughed, cooked together, shared stories over tea. No tension, no whispers, no choosing sides, just peace. And slowly, without realizing, pieces of me I thought were lost began returning. My voice, my hobbies, my smile. One evening, as we sat watching the sun dip behind the trees, she said, "You look like yourself again." I hadn't noticed, but she was right. One day, he visited. My son arrived unexpectedly, holding an old photo, one of him sitting on my lap, chubby cheeks and bright eyes. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked, "Can I sit? Just for tea?" There was no resentment in me, only softness. We talked, not as mother and child demanding love, but as two humans trying to understand each other. He apologized without words, I forgave without conditions. Some relationships aren't meant to be chosen. They simply exist, even through distance, even through hurt. I realized then, I was not broken, just bent for too long. And now I was standing again. When the door closed that night, the house suddenly felt too large for one heart. I walked through each room slowly, touching chairs, curtains, family frames, almost like I was saying goodbye without knowing why. There was no anger inside me, only a quiet emptiness that sat like air after rain, still. Morning tea, evening walks, conversations with neighbors who didn't know my heart carried old wounds stitched with patience. Sometimes I still look at the empty chair across from mine and imagine his voice, his smile, the warmth that once filled this home. One day, my phone finally lit with his name. I stared at it for a long moment, not in anger, but wondering if hearts remember time, or if they simply learn to heal around the absence. When I answered, his voice was small, like a child again. "Mother. Can I come see you?" I smiled, not wide, just enough that my heart softened like dawn. Love never asks who chose who. It only knows how to wait without closing its doors. If my son returns, I will welcome him. If he never does, I will still love him. Because motherhood is not a contract. It is a quiet promise, survival without possession, affection without condition. And even though my daughter-in-law asked him to choose, I learned to choose myself.